Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to this virtual workshop. Thank you all for joining. I hope it wasn't too difficult getting signed on to Zoom. I have to say, if you're watching from your phone or computer, if you're able to turn on the video, we do have some slides to share. But if you are just calling in from your phone, we will make a video recording of this virtual workshop available after the fact, and we'll email you a link. So you'll get to view it if you're not able to view it right now. And we'll do our best to make sure that those of you who can't see the photos we have in our slides, that you can follow along just as well. So welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to our soil health virtual workshop, Putting Your Garden to Rest. We're going to be talking about soil health practices for your garden and farm this fall and winter season. I'm a horticulture specialist with NCAT, working out of the Southeast office in Fayetteville, Arkansas, joined by my colleague Nina Prater, who's a soil specialist in our office. So a little bit more about NCAT, what we do, and our ATRA program. So NCAT, the National Center for Appropriate Technology, is a national nonprofit organization that does work in both sustainable agriculture and sustainable energy to reduce poverty, provide sustainable solutions. Our ATRA program is our sustainable agriculture program, and if you haven't been to our ATRA website, I would highly recommend it. This is our go-to hub for information on sustainable agriculture. We have hundreds of publications, a lot of videos and podcasts as well on sustainable agriculture, everything from soil health to organic production practices for vegetable crops to sustainable livestock production, poultry, grass-based cattle, hogs. Really, if you have a question about sustainable agriculture, you can probably find an answer at ATRA. So wanted to plug our ATRA website. And this is also a great place to go to ask one of our agriculture specialists a question. You can either reach us through our toll-free number, which is on the screen, 1-800-346-9140, or email us askanag@ncat.org, and one of our specialists will get back to you with an answer. This workshop is brought to you by the EPA through their environmental education program. And to make that connection between environmental stewardship and soil health is pretty easy. And I think Nina Prater, who's going to be presenting here in just a few minutes, will make that connection pretty well for you, pretty powerfully for you. But just want to remind you that as a gardener or farmer, you are a steward of your environment, and really the best way to get started with that is by caring for the soil and being a good steward of the soil, building soil health, caring for the soil, really because animal health, plant health, human health really springs from that. And so really want to kind of put this all into perspective that, by being a good steward of the soil, you are being a steward of your environment. Before we get started, I just have a few questions for you all. We're going to launch a poll. We want to get a sense of who's on the call this evening. So if you don't mind, once I launch this poll, could you answer if you are a farmer or rancher, a home gardener, an extension educator, a professor or instructor, a nonprofit staff or volunteer, or other? So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to answer this poll. For those of you on a computer or a phone with the Zoom app, if you don't mind giving us a sense of who our audience is this evening. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and in the poll, share the results. So it looks like 56% of you are home gardeners on the call, 24% are farmers or ranchers, 24% are nonprofit staff or volunteers, 24% are other. So very good to know. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to launch one more poll before Nina gets started. So the second question is going to be, where are you located? We just want to get a sense of where in the country you are. Are you in the Mid-South or Southeast? Are you in the Southwest, the Mountain West or Pacific Northwest, the Midwest, or Northeast? A lot of the cover crop recommendations I'm going to talk about are for the Southeast and Mid-South. So it'd be good to know if any of you are outside of that area. I'll give you guys a few more minutes to answer the poll. So it looks like 60% of you are in the Mid-South or Southeast. Very good. 21% are in the Southwest, 11% in the Midwest. All right. Very good. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Nina Prater to talk about principles of soil health.
Thank you, Luke. Hello, everybody. And I'm so excited to talk to you all tonight about my favorite subject. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us to talk about soil health. I am a soil specialist here with NCAT, and so my passion is sharing with people how to understand soil as a living thing and to give you the tools to manage your soil so that you are building your soil's health over time rather than degrading your soil's health. And so just to get started, I think it's helpful to understand what is it we're talking about? What is a healthy soil? Soil is an ecosystem, just like the ecosystems above ground that we're more familiar with. Like a forest ecosystem or a savanna ecosystem. Soil has its own ecosystem with the plants, the organic matter, the primary consumers, the predators, the prey, and in order for soil to be healthy, it has to have a vibrant ecosystem. And when it has that, it will function, it will be a productive functioning soil. So when it's healthy, nutrients will be cycling so that there'll be plant available. Water will infiltrate into your healthy soil. Your soil will have structure. If you can see the screen, you can see that there's a picture of someone holding two different types of soil. And one looks like it's loose and crumbly, and the other one looks like a block of solid soil. And the loose and crumbly one is the one that has soil structure. And that's what you need in order to have that living soil ecosystem. The blocky one is just a really compacted soil. So we want that soil structure to allow for root growth. And we want our soils to become enriched, more and more enriched every year over time, rather than becoming degraded, which is what often happens if you're not taking good care of your soil. And if you do all these things, you're going to have a productive, resilient garden or farm if you're a farmer. So next slide, Luke. So a key that no matter what kind of production system you're in, no matter what scale you're at, there's a commonality that we all share, and that is we're growing plants. And plants need good soil to be healthy, and also soil needs plants to be healthy. So one thing I want to explain about the plant-soil relationship is that plants feed the soil, and people commonly think of this as like plant matter on top of the soil falling down, breaks down and biodegrades and becomes part of the soil. But also plants feed the soil through their roots, and this is what some people call the liquid carbon pathway, because as plants photosynthesize, they take carbon and hydrogen and water and oxygen, and so they mix it all up and turn it into carbohydrates, which is sugars, and then 30 to 50% of that is exuded into the soil to feed the soil ecosystem, to feed those microbes. And so this is a really important way to build soil health, is to utilize this amazing property that plants have. And so I just wanted to take a minute to explain that process, because it's going to come into play in a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about. So next slide, Luke. I'm going to go over what people call the 5 principles of soil health. And these were arrived at by people looking at how soils are built in the natural environment, how nature has built soils over time. And they found some commonalities in all different environments of how soils, rich soil, healthy soils are built. And so these 5 soil principles are minimizing soil disturbance, maximizing biodiversity of the system, keeping the soil covered, living roots, having living roots growing in the ground as much of the year as possible. And then in natural systems, animals are always a part of the ecosystem. So including animals or their byproducts is another soil health principle. So let's just dive right into the details with the next slide, Luke. We're gonna get started with the first soil health principle, minimizing disturbance. So this, by disturbance, I mean either physical disturbance of like turning the soil through tillage, or chemical disturbance of introducing either pesticides or large amounts of fertilizer that are more than the ecosystem can handle. That's called chemical disturbance. So why is disturbance a problem? You know, most people think of tillage as just a natural part of agriculture. It's what everybody does, right? And it has been what everybody has done for many, many, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years, but it causes a lot of damage. And so we need to rethink tillage a little bit and make sure we're minimizing it. So when you till your soil, you expose it, which makes it vulnerable to wind and water erosion. And it also, this is a little bit more subtle because you can't see it happening, but you lose your soil organic matter when you till a lot. When you introduce all that oxygen when you till, the soil microbes go crazy and eat all that soil organic matter that's really good for the soil ecosystem, and it gets lost as carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So tillage can really damage your soil short-term and long-term. And then when you till, it degrades that soil structure. Those loose crumbs that are so important to the soil environment get broken up. And also it destroys mycorrhizal fungi. A lot of times we hear about the bad fungi in the soil that causes disease, but there's a whole other group of fungi in the soil that actually partner with plants and bring your plants nutrients that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access. So, but they have long, thin strands of fungi that you can't really see, and then when you till it, they're very fragile and they break up, and so you're destroying that connection. And so on the chemical disturbance side, adding too much nitrogen fertilizer can result in carbon loss, kind of in the same way as tilling and adding oxygen to the system does. It causes a burst of growth in the soil microbes, and they consume organic matter, and it leaves the soil as carbon dioxide. And nitrogen fertilizer can also result in soil acidification, making your soil pH too low for the plants. And then nitrogen fertilizer also can cause the legumes that you have in your soil to stop producing the nitrogen. So legumes fix nitrogen, but if you apply nitrogen fertilizer, they'll just take the free lunch and not do their job of fixing nitrogen in the soil for you. So you want to minimize the amount of these radical disturbances you cause in the soil. Luke, go ahead. So what does this look like in practice? So there's a lot of people developing no-till or minimum till practices on the farm scale or the garden scale. So I highly recommend looking into those. There's different tools that have been developed, implements that can help you do the jobs you need to do to grow your crops, but without tilling the soil. So no-till drills, spaders, harrows, roller crimpers, things like that. And then if you really are set on promoting soil health, you can also just switch to a perennial production system instead of growing annual crops. You could switch to growing fruit trees. I know that's kind of radical, but it's one option if you really are trying to reduce tillage. And then another way to avoid spraying pesticides is you can design your farm, make sure to plan your farm for biological control. So planting habitats for beneficial insects that can control your pests and things like that. That will overall reduce your need to use insecticides or things like that that can really disrupt the soil microbiome, or the soil macrobiome, even the insects in your soil that help it out. So that's a little bit, you have to look at your farm sort of big picture to do that, but I think it's really important on a number of levels, including soil health. And then making sure that you are managing your soil fertility on a more biological approach. So using nitrogen fixation through legumes, green manures like cover crops, and adding compost as a source of fertilizer. Just things that aren't so extreme, like a huge burst of nitrogen all at once without any of the carbon and other micronutrients that are necessary. So those are some ways in practice that you can minimize disturbance. Now, you know, we're all in, it's fall now, we're putting our gardens to bed. So we're all thinking about maybe the end of the season and what you can do to prepare for next year. So just some little tricks as you're cleaning up your garden at the end of the year. You can, instead of pulling things up by the root, just cut them off at the root and leave the roots there to decompose. That's a small thing you can do to minimize disturbance in your soil. You could plant some legume crops right now. Luke will talk more about different options for that. You can go ahead and start planting some beneficial insect habitat that might be ready to grow next year to get those beneficials that you need. And then applying compost now so that it's more of a slow release and it can work its way into your soil over the winter time so that your soil fertility is ready to go next year. So those are just some things that you could do right now to prepare for next year to make sure you're minimizing disturbance and following that soil health principle. Those are some practices that you can apply. So let's go on to the next soil health principle, maximizing biodiversity. So biodiversity just means as many different kinds of plants and animals that you can have on your land as possible. So when you have diversity, you have resiliency, and that means that you'll have something growing, whether it's a wet year or a dry year. You'll always have some crop that can succeed. And so when you have a resilient soil that can rebound from drought or wet years, you'll have a resilient farm. And of course, that's what we're all going for, is to be able to grow no matter what the conditions. And you know, people say as above, so below. You know, if you have diverse plants above ground, you'll have diverse microbes below ground. And that will mean that no matter what the conditions, there'll be microbes under there doing their nutrient cycling, consuming and releasing nutrients for the plants, no matter what the conditions. So maximizing biodiversity is a really, really important one to do on your farm. So in practice, can you go to the next slide? This looks like having diverse fruit and vegetable types on your farm, cool season, warm season, different varieties maybe. And then making sure you're planning your crop rotations so that they add diversity over time to your soil. And then having diverse cover crops in between your cash crops is a really great way to add diversity to the soil. And then if you are a livestock farmer, I like to throw in livestock farmer stuff in here because that's what we do on our farm. So I always have to include that. But having a diverse pasture is really important for the pasture health, the soil health, and your livestock health. And then animals, which are part of the diverse collection of life on the landscape, they add microbial diversity to the farm through their manure. They have lots of microbes in their gut, and they deposit that on their farm. It's a little probiotic for your land. So animals are really, really great that way. And then another way to add diversity to your soil is through adding inoculations, like you may have heard of compost teas. These are systems people have developed to add those microbes directly to your farm. If your soil is really abused, that can give it a boost. And then I always like to give a plug for wildlife. I don't like to exclude them on the farm. I think we all need to farm with them in mind, leaving spaces for wildlife, and I think that's good to include on your farm or garden landscape. So those are all ways you can maximize biodiversity in practice. And now that it's fall, there's how can you add more kinds of life to your farm right now? Winter is a great time to plant fruit trees if you don't have fruit trees established on your farm. Fall is a great time to plant cover crops, perennials. So those are things you can do right now to add some biodiversity to your farm. Different things to think about. So the next soil health principle is keeping it covered. This one, I like to point out that in nature, it's almost never that you see bare soil. That's because plants always take over soil, and that is how soil grows. So if you have exposed soil, it becomes eroded soil. And if you have exposed soil in the summers, especially here in Arkansas where we are, it becomes very, very hot, and those soil microbes shut down. They are just like you and me. When it gets too hot, they don't want to do the work. So they will stop cycling those nutrients for your plants. And so keeping the soil covered really moderates that temperature. And then exposed soil also equals poor water infiltration. When the raindrops hit bare soil, they end up creating a little thin crust at the top of the soil, and that's very hard for the water to then infiltrate through. And so you get things like runoff, and you get things like ponding that you can see in this picture. There's an orchard that is just flooded with water because that orchard had bare soil between all those trees, and when it rained, it could not infiltrate. So keeping that soil covered would have solved that problem a lot. Okay, so in practice, next slide. There we go. One great way to keep your soil covered is mulch. Mulch is mulching around plants, mulching between rows, and then cover cropping. When you have live plants growing, they're protecting the soil for you. And then if you have an orchard growing in between in the alleys between the trees is a really important thing to do for your soil. And then if you are a livestock farmer, making sure your pasture plants are a tall enough height that you're not overgrazing and exposing your soil through overgrazing. And so, now that it's fall and you're probably cleaning up your garden bed, I highly, highly recommend covering it up for the winter. whether it's, you know, you're raking up leaves and piling those on your garden bed. Earthworms love to eat leaves, so that's a great way to promote soil life, and inexpensive. And then straw, if you can access straw. I have used hay bales, although people caution against that because of weed seeds, and that's definitely a problem. But I've had straw with a lot of seeds in it too, so I don't know, you can't win, I guess, but it's important to do anyway. And but any way you can to cover up and protect that soil while it's dormant for the winter, you'll be so much better off next year. Your soil will be slowly enriched over the winter, and it won't have eroded and gotten damaged through exposure. And then of course cover cropping, and then leaving that plant residue throughout the winter. So next slide.
Hey, Nina, real quick, there's a question about using wood from a local recycling center.
Wood chips. Yes, that is a really valuable source of nutrients, and very inexpensive or free. So that's always good. The one caution with wood chips is that because they're so rich in carbon, they can tie up the nitrogen in your soil. So it depends on what you're using them for. I think they're really, really good around fruit and nut trees or bushes, like blueberries and things like that, brambles. I use them in my pathways in my garden, but I would hesitate to use them around growing vegetable crops, just because of that nitrogen tie-up problem. So that's my perspective on wood chips. I don't know, Luke might have another idea, but that's the direction I lean. I think they're really, really good to use. I would just be a little cautious about the nitrogen problem. So did I answer that question well enough? Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, great. So thank you, and thank you for asking. If people have other questions, you know, feel free to enter them in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer. So the next soil health principle is living roots, and I explained a little bit about why this is so important at the beginning of the talk, and it ties in with keeping the soil covered. You want the soil covered either with living roots or with living plants or with mulch. And if you have continuous living cover in your garden, you will have continuous enrichment of your soil. Those plants are going to be adding so much to your soil, the organic matter, and feeding that soil microbial ecosystem that's going on under there. You're feeding the soil food web. And I really like to motivate people to really get greedy for sunlight. You want to, you know, sunlight's free, and you want to capture it as much as possible on your farm for as much of the year as possible. Because that is what enriches your soil, and plants do that for you. So keep those living plants through all the shoulders of the season, you know, the hot weather, the cold weather, you know, just try and get as creative as you can of getting living roots in your soil as much of the year as you can. Next slide. So how do you do this? You can do it through diverse cover cropping. Luke will talk about this, but having cover crops that you can work into your crop rotations, spring, summer, fall, and then winter. And then using really careful crop planning, so that when you're done harvesting one crop, you're ready to plant the next one, so that you can have a cash crop growing in that soil as much of the year as possible. And if you're a livestock person, having diverse pasture plants that can utilize the warm weather and the cold weather, so that you've got robust plant growth all year long. And then, and then if you have a perennial production model, you're going to have those trees there all the time. So that's another way to have living roots. And just make sure you're covering the gaps of throughout the growing season. And I'm going to let Luke talk a lot more about the ways to use cover crops to do that later. Okay, next slide. So including animals, my personal favorite. But this, you do have to be careful with including animals because of food safety. You know, if you're growing vegetables and animals in the same place, you want to make sure you're not contaminating your crops. But one of the amazing things about animals is what great nutrient cyclers animals are. So, for example, on our farm, we have a cow-calf operation, and one 1,000-pound cow will eat about 25 pounds of dry matter per day, but 80% of that returns to the soil as manure and urine, which then fertilizes that soil. And then 20% of that becomes delicious meat that you can sell or eat for your family. And so you're fertilizing that soil, you're getting this great healthy byproduct, and you're stimulating that plant growth. The grazing, if you're doing careful grazing management, it leads to this plant growth pulse that you can manage very carefully to make sure that you are that you're stimulating plant growth as much of the year as you can and building that soil. That's how all these amazing prairie soils in the Midwest came to be, with large ruminants in the form of buffalo grazing on those prairies and creating those amazing soils I'm so jealous of. So animals can be a really great soil building tool. Next slide. So in practice, how you work this into your system. If you're a gardener, it can be a little trickier, especially if you're in town. You know, there's all kinds of rules about livestock in cities, but you know, if you can have a few chickens, that can add some fertility to your soil. And I know people build these amazing little chicken mobiles that they can have go down the rows of their garden and help have those chickens enrich the soil and eat bugs and things like that. So you just have to look at your system and see if there's a creative way you can partner with animals, partner with a livestock farmer and work animals into the system to improve your nutrient cycling and add fertility to your soil. You have to do it carefully because animals can cause a lot of damage. But done carefully, it can be a really powerful tool to build fertility over time. And if there's no way you can include animals on your land, I think composted manures are a really great source of fertility. The great thing about them is it's kind of like a complete diet for your soil food web. Instead of just feeding them junk food, like just straight nitrogen, you can give them a complete diet with all the carbon and the micronutrients and things like that your soil food web really thrives on. And so I think it's great to just use the analogy of, you know, your own body. You can't survive on one nutrient alone. You have to eat a wide variety of foods, and composted manure has that wide variety of nutrients that your soil needs. And like I said before, you have to make sure you're keeping food safety in mind when using livestock. And then another caveat I would add for animal manures is there is a persistent herbicide that can get passed through livestock into the manure it's a family of herbicides called aminopyralids. Some of the common names are milestone or grazon. And the cow can eat hay that has been sprayed by those herbicides, and then it will pass through into the manure, and then even if it's composted, it can persist in the compost. And then if you apply that to your garden, it can kill your plants. So make sure you're talking to the local farmer who you're getting manure from, and making sure that that it isn't going to be contaminated, because that has set farmers back years in some cases trying to deal with that problem. So another option, some people use worm castings as a source of fertility. I saw a comment, I think I saw a chat about watching for nutrient buildup in the soil. This is a really great point. No matter what your source of fertility is, you have to make sure you're maintaining a balance. Over applying any fertilizer, whether it's manure or commercial fertilizer, whatever it is, can lead to either nutrient buildup in the soil and nutrient runoff, which can really damage waters, lakes, and streams and things like that. So be very, very careful, no matter what your fertility strategy is, to make sure you're not adding too much.
Nina, there was a question: is chicken manure or cow manure better?
You have to be careful with chicken manure, because if you apply it straight, it can be too high in nitrogen, and it can be too hot, they call it. It can burn your plants. I think the thing to do would be to you can Google like the typical nutrient amounts in different kinds of manures that you can expect to have, and then have your soil tested, see what nutrients it needs, and try and match up the nutrient needs of your soil and the manure that best supplies those nutrients. I see a comment about rabbit manure. I hear really good things about rabbit manure. And if you've been getting good results, keep doing it. I'm thinking about getting my kids pet rabbits just so I can have rabbit manure for my garden. Okay, so I'm only seeing random chats as they come up. I haven't seen all of them, so I'm sorry if I've missed anyone. And okay, next slide. So I think it's really important to know if what you're doing is working. You know, we're putting in all this work into our gardens. It's a lot of work, or our farms. And how can you tell that you're making progress? Well, I recommend soil testing on a fairly regular basis. I use the University of Arkansas Extension Services soil testing, and it's free unless you get the organic matter test run, which I always do. I think knowing how much organic matter in the soil is really important, because it helps give you an indicator of how well you're feeding your soil food web. And there's other soil tests available out there that cost a little more money, like a Haney test or an earth fort test or a PLFA, and it can get really complicated. But if you're curious about what's in your soil, I would look into what soil tests there are, and start with your extension service soil testing, and that's a good baseline. And other things you can do is on-farm soil assessments, and this is, you know, as simple as going out there, digging a hole, looking at it, feeling that soil, smelling it, seeing if it has that good garden soil smell. Looking at the color, is it getting darker every year? Dark soil generally means richer soil, because that organic matter is what gives it that dark color. And there's a test that is really interesting called a slake test. I recommend you look on YouTube for different slake test videos. Ray Archuleta does a really great one. Where you basically see what happens when you get some of your soil and you drop it into a column of water, like with a little basket at the top, and then see if it breaks apart and dissolves, or if it holds together in that structure. And you want soil that holds together in a structure. That gives you a good measure of your soil structure and how well it holds together. An infiltration ring, that's another thing you can look up videos for to see how well water enters your soil. And then you can dig a hole and count how many earthworms are in a square foot of your soil. That's a great indicator over time of how your soil food web is doing. And then another great indicator is that we're most familiar with is looking at your plants. How well are your plants doing? Are they looking really robust and dark green and healthy looking, or are they struggling? Are they yellow? Are they purple sometimes? They can be a good indicator of nutrient deficiencies in your soil. And then keeping good records of when you fertilize and what your crop rotations are, when you plant and what your yields are. I apologize for spelling yield wrong. That really bothers me. And keeping good records will help you keep track of what works and what doesn't. You might think you will remember next year, but if you're anything like me, you will not. So write it down. And then there's a new technology that's not quite out there yet, but it's a nutrient density meter. And it's a meter that's being developed that isn't on the market yet, but keep an eye out for it to measure how much the nutrient density of the food you're growing. So I don't know, it's something to keep an eye out for. I'm curious about how it'll work, but like you can measure your kale and see how nutrient dense it is, and if it's good, then you have good soil. If it's low, then you maybe have some soil problems. So those are just some ways to tell that the hard work that you're doing is working. And I think that's really important to keep assessing what you're doing. All right, next slide. So Luke talked about how the soil health relates to the environment. And I think it's critical. I think it's can't be overstated. The pictures, if you're on the computer or on your phone, you can see our floods that happened here in Arkansas last year. And this, you know, we're seeing more and more extreme weather events like extreme rainfall. And if we have soil that can't absorb water, can't infiltrate water, it's just going to get worse and worse. Another example I like to share is the Dust Bowl. That is another classic example of what happens to the environment if we don't take care of our soil. That was one of the worst environmental catastrophes that our country has ever seen. And we still have major wind erosion problems today. And so if each one of us takes care of our own parcel of land, then it's going to create a landscape that can absorb these major rainfalls and that can resist major wind events. And so we'll keep the soil in place and we'll keep the broader landscape healthy. So there's a huge amount at stake. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind. What we do really matters and can have a big impact on a broader scale. And next slide. And I'd just like to end on a positive note because building soil is often an extremely beautiful way to manage your land. This is a picture of Luke's farm, and he's got biodiversity, he's got soil that's covered, he's got grassed walkways, he's got so many of these soil principles at work on this landscape, and it is beautiful. And I think that we really, you know, we could all use as much beauty in our lives as we can get, and it'll keep you motivated to keep going. I think that, you know, farming and gardening is really hard work, and we need this positive feedback that beauty gives us. So I just like to end on a positive note that all this biodiversity and keeping things covered, it really creates a beautiful landscape for us to be in. So with that, I don't know if we want to answer a few questions now or keep on going with Luke's presentation.
There was one question earlier about what causes how the soil gets compacted. I didn't want that one to get missed.
Okay, yeah. There's a number of ways soil can get compacted. You know, too much like traffic driving on it or walking on it, or if livestock are on it too much and it doesn't get any rest. Those are all different ways that soil can get compacted. If you till it too much and it doesn't, and you don't have that organic matter to feed the soil microbes that build that structure, it can lead to compaction. So there's many ways soil can get compacted, and it's a major challenge, but it can be reversed. So you can use cover crops or use you know, different methods like that to reverse compaction. So it's not, you know, the end of the world, but it is something that you do have to work hard on to address to make sure it doesn't just have a negative feedback loop of getting worse and worse.
Okay. I do want to address, there was one question to me privately about the plastic mulch in the garden, about keeping soil covered with plastic. And I want to just mention real quickly that in that photo, that's landscape fabric, which is breathable. So it does let water in and allows for air exchange between the soil and the air. And also with that landscape fabric, at least in my garden, I pull it up every season so that the soil is allowed to breathe. And I do rotate crops throughout my beds, so that soil isn't covered in that plastic for years and years and years. So that's how we use that landscape fabric in our garden. Just wanted to address that since someone had a question.
Yeah, that's a good question. And yeah. Another thing that I didn't mention before is sometimes people use like silage tarp or things like that to kill weeds without having to till. So it can be a tool to minimize disturbance as well. But I know there are some questions about the sustainability of using large amounts of plastic that can't be recycled in our farming systems. But I think used conscientiously, like Luke was saying, reusing it year after year and rotating it, it can be a good way to protect your soil and manage weeds, which are always a challenge.
Definitely. So I know we've gotten several questions in our chat, but we're gonna have to table those for the end. I'm gonna go ahead and get started talking about cover crops, and then Margaret, if you could take note of some of these questions we didn't get to answer. Hopefully we'll have time at the end to address those. And again, yes, thank you everyone.
And Nina may address some of them in the chat while you're talking too.
Perfect. All right, well, thank you, Nina. Right, I'm gonna spend the next half hour digging a little deeper into winter cover crops, which Nina introduced. We're going to talk about different winter cover crop species and also winter cover crop management. Before I get started on that, I want to ask you guys a few of these polling questions. The first question is, have you grown winter cover crops before? I'm going to go ahead and launch this. So you can either answer yes, you've grown winter cover crops before, no, but you've grown summer cover crops, or no, you haven't grown any cover crops before. If you don't mind answering that for me quickly, we will post those results. I'm just curious about your experience with winter cover crops. Okay, sharing results. All right, so it looks like most of you, 65% of you, have not grown any cover crops before. So I hope this serves as a great introduction and maybe encourages you to get started this fall or planting cover crops in the spring. And it looks like about 30% of you do have experience growing winter cover crops. So I hope those of you can glean something new from what I'm talking about. And I have one more question for you guys. So this one is, what winter cover crops have you grown before? This one you can answer different options. You can answer multiple choices here. We have rye, oats, clover, vetch, winter peas, mustards, radishes, turnips, others, or I haven't grown any winter cover crops. So for those of you who have experience with winter cover crops, if you wouldn't mind telling me which ones you've grown before. Okay, I'll go ahead and share results. What do we see here? Okay, so it looks like more common winter cover crops for all of you are rye, clover, winter peas, radishes. Okay, very good to know. Well, hope you guys get introduced to new winter cover crops that you're interested in trying on your farm. All right, so jumping right in. Within winter cover crops, I like to divide them out into categories, families, which I'll divide into three. So we're going to talk about grass, legume, and brassica winter cover crops. So grass species, this would include winter grains like rye, oats, winter wheat, barley. So these are monocots. Those are winter grains, which I mentioned, which grow taller, have a higher proportion of carbon in their biomass, are fast growing. And one attribute of all of these is that they do make good catch crops, which means they do a really good job of scavenging for any excess nitrogen left in the soil at the end of a cropping cycle, pulling that nitrogen up into the biomass and trapping it so that nitrogen doesn't leach out of your soil through the fall and winter time. Next category is legume winter cover crops. These ones are really special because of their ability to fix nitrogen through biological nitrogen fixation, which happens in the roots. Here's another photo similar to one you saw in Nina's slides of roots of, in this case, it's Austrian winter pea, and you can see all those nodules on the roots, which is where that nitrogen fixation occurs with the assistance of rhizobia bacteria. And so an important note on this is legumes, to get that nitrogen fixation, they should be inoculated with a inoculant that matches the species of legume you're planting. You can buy some inoculants that are for peas and beans, kind of a broad spectrum inoculant. Others are more specialized for clover or for peas, etc. But it's important to get that inoculant on the seed to ensure you get good nitrogen fixation, because that happens as a result of that infection of the roots by good bacteria. Next, brassica species. So, brassicas, I'm sure all of you gardeners are familiar with, also known as cole crops. In the garden, that's broccoli, kale, cabbage, cauliflower. In cover crops, this would be radishes, mustards, turnips. And these species have some similar characteristics. They are fast growing. They can germinate in warmer soil temperatures. Some can grow in the summertime. They're more typically grown as a fall winter cover crop. They are allelopathic, so they're very good at out-competing other weeds. So you can easily establish a single stand of a brassica cover crop, and it'll prevent weeds from growing up with it. When mixed with other cover crops, you have to be careful about the seeding rate so that it doesn't inadvertently choke out any other cover crop species you're trying to grow with that brassica cover crop. Okay, so now I want to get into some species, kind of describe these in more detail for you all. So cereal rye, as I mentioned, this is a grass. So it's going to grow 3 to 6 feet tall, has a very extensive fibrous root system, which, as I was talking about before, is very good at scavenging for nitrogen left over in the soil after a cropping cycle. It can also help break up a soil. That fibrous root system Like Nina was talking about, those roots are pumping carbon into the soil. So CORI is going to help you build soil, increase that carbon in the soil, increase organic matter. And when you're seeding it, it needs to be seeded at roughly 100 pounds of seed per acre. CORI is a good workhorse winter cover crop, a good winter grain. I really like, as a simple combination, to mix cereal rye with crimson clover. It's a very good mixture right there. Okay, another winter grain would be oats. So oats don't grow quite as tall as cereal rye. They'll grow 2 to 5 feet tall. They're commonly grown as a nurse crop. So if you have a slow growing winter legume, the oats can serve as quick ground cover, preventing weeds from growing up while that slow growing winter cover crop gets established. So that would be the case of, say you're growing hairy vetch or crimson clover. Oats would be a good nurse crop for those if you're wanting to get those established. One unique aspect of oats, for those of us with cold winter temperatures, good winter freezes, it can actually winter kill. So what that means is if it gets cold enough for long enough in the wintertime, which often happens for us here in Northwest Arkansas, the oats will actually die back in the wintertime, which will leave you in the spring with a nice mat of killed cover crop residue, which can serve as a mulch, which you could plant into no-till. You could easily transplant some spring crops into that killed mulch, or if you're on a larger scale, use a no-till drill to seed into that, or some strip tillage to till strips to plant into. So oats are a good winter grass to plant as a cover crop if you're wanting to work the soil early in the spring. And both of these grasses, at least for us here in Northwest Arkansas, mid-September is that ideal time to plant them. So I know we're a little bit after that, September 23rd, but that's the target range. I would say getting them in, before October would be ideal. Crimson clover. This is one of my favorite winter legumes. It's just so beautiful in the spring with those showy red flowers. So as I mentioned, crimson clover is a great companion to rye. That's a good legume grass combination for winter. So crimson clover, being a legume, fixes nitrogen, like I was talking about, in those nodules in the root system. At best, crimson clover can fix 160 pounds of nitrogen, which is quite significant, and can supply a good portion of a vegetable crop's nitrogen budget right there. Some details on that nitrogen fixation. So it happens in the root system. That nitrogen is being pulled out of the air. It exchanges with a soil atmosphere that's absorbed by the roots, and then is incorporated into the plant. And so for that nitrogen to be available for the next crop, that cover crop needs to be incorporated into the soil. So mowed down, tilled in, or if, say, that crimson clover is left on the soil surface in the spring and summer, that nitrogen is going to slowly break down and slowly release into the soil. But to get the most out of that nitrogen fixation from a legume, the most efficient way to get it into the soil for your next crop is to mow and incorporate that cover crop, which I know Nina was talking about how bad tillage is, but sometimes it's a necessary evil, especially for vegetable production. Other facts about crimson clover: you're going to see most of that growth in the spring, so it's really good to pair it with a fast-growing grass to get good soil coverage in the fall. And it can actually be overseeded into a fall vegetable crop. So if you're growing broccoli or cabbage, for example, you could overseed that crop while it's still in the garden or still on the farm, broadcast crimson clover over that vegetable crop and allow that crimson clover to start to grow while the vegetable crop's still in the ground. And then by the time you're harvesting the broccoli or cabbage, that crimson clover has established and can take over. Again, planting dates for crimson clover and the other legumes I'm going to talk about for the most part. It's going to be mid-September here in Northwest Arkansas. Okay, someone mentioned alfalfa as a cover crop for winter. Not recommended. It is more of a pasture forage. If you're wanting to do a long-term, like multi-year cover crop, alfalfa could be suited to that. But for just kind of a short season winter cover crop, I would not recommend alfalfa. And someone's talking about container gardening cover crops for winter. In container gardening, I think you would get a better bang for your buck getting compost, using compost to add to the soil to feed the soil that way. Okay, hairy vetch, another fun winter cover crop. This one is a little more vining, a little more difficult to deal with. It's a little more messy, but growing this with a grass like rye gives it structure, something to grow up. It will tend to grow prostrate on the ground and can be a little difficult to mow as a single species cover crop, but it does offer a lot of nitrogen fixation, up to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Another thing to keep in mind with hairy vetch is timely termination, so killing it at the right time, preventing it from going to seed, preventing it from setting hard seed is really important because hairy vetch can become a weed problem in your garden or on your farm if you let it go to seed. And I'm going to spend some time specifically talking about termination here in just a few minutes, so we'll get to talk about that. Austrian winter pea, maybe my second favorite winter legume. This one is a great winter cover crop for those of you who maybe are just now thinking about growing winter cover crops. You listen to this workshop and you're wanting to do it, but it's a little late. Austrian winter peas are your guy. They can be seeded late. I would say as late as mid-October for us in Northwest Arkansas, similar growing regions. They do a really good job growing in late fall, tolerating cold temperatures, and you can get good nitrogen fixation with them, up to 130 pounds per acre. They can even be grown as a single species cover crop at seeding rates of 60 to 90 pounds per acre. Just make sure to inoculate to get that nitrogen fixation. Or you can mix them with rye or wheat. They also benefit from some kind of structure, something to grow up, some kind of vertical crop as kind of a living trellis, like the hairy vetch. Okay, now some brassica species of note. Tillage radish, which the garden variety is called daikon radish. Tillage radish is kind of the cover crop cultivar of daikon radish. So this is a brassica, a deep-rooted, tap-rooted cover crop. If you're looking at the slide, you can see that thick root. What it's really good at is what's termed bio-drilling, which refers to that taproot drilling down and then that expansion of the root breaking up hard pans in the soil, essentially creating soil pores and increasing soil tilth, increasing penetration. Very good for hard compacted soils. It's fast growing. Definitely want to get it started early in the fall, mid-September. To get good fall growth before wintertime, it can winter kill if winter temperatures are cold enough, which is a vegetable grower that's to your benefit. That gives you early access to your field in the spring. It's very weed suppressive, so you're not going to have many spring weeds growing in the field where you plant tillage radish. But something to note, for good crop rotation, you're not going to want to follow tillage radish with another brassica. So no for cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, kale, or radishes or turnips. But following it with a lettuce crop, carrots, something in a different family would be great. Mustard, another brassica winter cover crop species. Again, fast growing, allelopathic. It's going to suppress weeds. Can easily be a single species cover crop. And in the mustard cover crop family, there are now a lot of biofumigant mustard cultivars that have been bred for a high content of glucosinolates, which is a compound found in mustards that when it's incorporated into the soil, it acts as a biofumigant to actually suppress or kill soil-borne pathogens. So this is a good cover crop if you're experiencing soil-borne disease problems, in your vegetable beds or your vegetable field on your farm. Something to note for using a mustard biofumigant cover crop, if it's planted in the fall, again, kind of a mid-September plant date for us here, incorporating it once it starts to flower. So mowing it down and then tilling it in as soon as it's mowed to incorporate that residue as soon as you mow it to maximize that biofumigant potential. And then you can even tarp your field or tarp your plot with clear plastic, or you could use a silage tarp to trap in those gases and get maximum biofumigant benefit from your mustard cover crop. Okay, so a note on multi-species mixes. So Nina talked about this. Diversity above ground leads to diversity below ground, and a lot of research on cover crop mixes has shown that, has supported that. And one thing I was talking about, that legume grass combination is a great combination to get started. But the more species you add, the better. It can get a little tricky when it comes to seeding rates. And this is where an online tool, for example, Green Cover Seed Company has an online cover crop seeding calculator where you can actually calculate the seeding rates for a multi-species mix. Other resources, which we'll mention at the end of the presentation, like Sarah's book on cover crops, does provide some seeding rate recommendations for cover crop mixes. It does get a little complicated calculating seeding rates if you're mixing different species, but it can be done. There are a lot of resources out there. Something to think about is balancing that carbon and nitrogen ratio, and it really depends on what your goal is. So a legume grown by itself is going to have fairly narrow carbon to nitrogen ratio, which is more nitrogen to carbon compared to other plant tissue, which means that nitrogen is going to be more readily available once you incorporate the cover crop. And what can happen if you have too much nitrogen in the soil all at once, it can easily leach out of your soil system if there's not something planted in the soil right away, or maybe your following vegetable crop doesn't have an extensive enough root system to pull all that nitrogen up. You can actually lose nitrogen if you have a too narrow carbon to nitrogen ratio in your cover crop mix and it gets incorporated. So balancing out that legume with a grass gives you a wider carbon to nitrogen ratio, a little more carbon to your nitrogen, which leads to slower nitrogen release, which does a better job of tracking the nitrogen uptake of your vegetable crop that follows And it also helps build soil carbon. Too much soil nitrogen can lead to soil carbon being consumed by the soil microbiome and being released as carbon gas. So that's one benefit of a good mix, balancing that carbon to nitrogen ratio. Also height considerations, which I was talking about, and then different rooting depths of cover crops is really beneficial. So they're pulling nutrients from different strata of the soil. All right, so planting. The ideal planting equipment for cover crops is a seed drill if you're working on a farm scale. And that ensures that that seed gets buried at the proper depth, gets good seed soil contact. You're going to get the best germination rates, best establishment if you use a seed drill. But I understand not everyone has a seed drill. And so broadcasting is commonly practiced as a means to plant cover crop seed. And this can be done by hand or using some kind of broadcasting tool, broadcasting equipment, either something you sling over your shoulder, or they're even tractor mounted broadcasters. Important thing is making sure your seeding rate's correct, and so it helps to divide out the field into halves or quarters and divide out your seed accordingly, and seed a half at a time or a quarter at a time, so that you don't end up with all your seed on one half of the field. Now, incorporating seed, if you're broadcasting, this is an additional step to get good germination rate. It can be done with a rake if you're just planting on a garden scale, shallowly incorporating that seed, 1 to 2 inches at the deepest if you're doing larger seeded cover crops. Tillers can be used, just till very shallowly, or using a disc. If you're on the tractor scale, discs that shallowly bury that seed. Irrigation is usually not required for planting fall cover crops, winter cover crops, because of fall rainfall. But if you're planting during a dry season, or say in a high tunnel, like in this photo, you do need to get some irrigation out there for germination of your cover crop. Okay, when to terminate. So as I was talking a little bit about termination earlier, with the legumes and brassicas, it's pretty easy to tell when to terminate. Once you start seeing flowers, if you're at 10% to 50% flower, that's your window to terminate. So the risk is if you wait too late, those flowers naturally are going to develop seeds, and you don't want seeds because you don't want weeds. And so making sure to kill that cover crop before it can set seed is really important, so you don't end up with a weed issue. For your grasses, it's a little more difficult to tell because the flowers aren't as obvious. So I have this image here for those of you who are watching, can see the slide. So you're wanting to terminate a grain like rye when it's in the soft dough stage. What that means is if you grab one of those grains, one of those seeds off the head of your crop, if you squeeze it, you want it to kind of be a milky white doughy texture that you can squeeze out. If those seeds are hard, you've waited too long. A problem with some of these grains like rye, it can be hard to terminate. It can be hard to kill. It wants to grow back after you mow it, even after you till it in. If you wait until it's at the soft dough stage, most of its energy is now in the reproductive phase. It's trying to devote that energy to ripening seed, and so it's going to be much less likely to grow back if you wait until the soft dough stage. If you terminate it too early, it's more likely it's going to grow back. So that's the ideal time to terminate your grains. Okay, I have a polling question here, but for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this. So we're going to talk about equipment real quick. And a lot of this depends on the scale you're operating on. So I'm going to talk about equipment on different scales. So mowing is a very important step in terminating your cover crops. And if you're at the tractor scale, a flail mower is ideal for mowing down your cover crop in the spring, which typically is mid-April, at least for us here in Northwest Arkansas. That's when most of the winter cover crops are ready to terminate, mid-April. A brush hog can also do fine work. A flail mower is just going to get a finer finer particle size. If you're using a two-wheel tractor like a BCS, you could use a brush hog on a BCS. They also make flail mowers for the BCS, or a sickle bar mower, which is going to cut the cover crop off at the base and leave a lot of residue, which can serve as mulch. If you're at a very small scale, here's a photo from my garden, just using a Japanese grass sickle to cut a cover crop, which kind of works like a sickle bar on a BCS. That works, or you can use a weed eater. You can get creative. Just something to mow down that cover crop. The rule of thumb is if you're wanting to till it in, you want a finer particle size, smaller particle size. If you're wanting to leave it on the surface as a mulch, kind of no-till style, you want to preserve a lot of that biomass. Roller crimpers. Nina mentioned this. Newer technology applicable to no-till farming. Roller crimpers, what they do is they roll down a cover crop. Just the weight of the wheel of the roller flattens them, and then the crimper, so that kind of chevron edge on the roller, it crimps, kind of bends the stem of the cover crop to prevent it from continuing to grow, to kind of cut off any vascular flow to that plant tissue, and it'll just stay on the surface as a dried killed mulch, or at least that's the idea. When I was working at the Kerr Center in Oklahoma and we were experimenting with the roller crimper on the BCS, it just wasn't heavy enough to get a good kill on winter cover crops like hairy vetch or crimson clover. So it's not foolproof, but it has been used very effectively by some vegetable growers. And I would say it's more effective on some of those taller grass winter cover crops like rye or wheat. It would be more effective on those. Incorporation, once you mow, you need to get it into the soil, at least, if you're using tillage. So breaking discs can be very effective at that. Moldboard plow can be used, though that's a little more soil disturbance than I like to see. You could use a spader as well to incorporate that cover crop residue. As I mentioned before, if your goal is nitrogen fixation, getting that legume cover crop residue in the soil is going to yield the most nitrogen return from your cover crop. Alternatively, you can leave that cover crop residue on the surface. So if you use something like a sickle bar mower, that preserves a lot of that biomass, you have a lot of that residue you can leave on the surface. It's going to serve as a dry mulch, and you can just rake that mulch where you need it, and that biomass will slowly decompose, return to the soil, kind of slow release. One note is you're not going to get as efficient a return on nitrogen if you allow that, but it does minimize soil disturbance. So that is a benefit of using that cover crop residue as a surface mulch. On a small scale application, these are some photos from my garden where I just cut that cover crop by hand with a sickle bar, and I used, in this case, it was a rye, mustard, crimson clover mix. I used it as mulch on my tomatoes. So some potential pitfalls. Planting too late is a big one. You definitely want to plant timely. As I mentioned, the time is now to plant your winter cover crops. So if you're interested in it, get to it. You want good establishment of your cover crops in the fall going into winter time. That's very important. Proper seeding rates is important. If you're broadcasting, getting that seed incorporated is very important. Because if you don't have good seeding rates and you have a poor stand, you're going to end up with a lot of weeds that are growing up in that cover crop. And a bunch of weeds comes weed seed. And the point of cover crops is to suppress weeds and be more manageable biomass. Some resources for cover crop seed. I mentioned green cover seed. They have a great cover crop seeding calculator tool on their website, greencoverseed.com. But all the seed companies now seem to carry cover crop seed, including Johnny's, Peaceful Valley, Southern Exposure, Deer Creek Seed, have a good selection of cover crop seed. Some of it's marketed as a seed for deer plots, but a lot of the species are the same. Here in Fayetteville, I bought a lot of seed from our local farmers cooperative. So, if you have a farmers co-op or something like that in your area, you can usually find a lot of these species there. Some additional resources to mention: ATRA, again, NCAT.atra.org. We have publications on cover crops, on soil management. The SARE book I mentioned is called Managing Cover Crops Profitably, which you can access for free on the SARE website, and download a free PDF version of that. That's going to give you some good seeding rates for different cover crop mixes. Also some more cover crop species and profiles of different cover crops. Teaming with Microbes is a great book that Nina wanted to be sure to include in the resources. Really good book on an introduction to the soil food web, building soil health in the garden and on the farm. Okay, before we take some more questions, just want to plug some upcoming workshops we've got. Kind of doing a virtual workshop series here. In 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about managing pests organically in a garden and orchard with Guy Ames, who, if you don't know Guy Ames, he's a dynamic speaker, to say the least. An orchardist, nurseryman. He's going to talk a lot about organic principles of pest management and pest management in your orchard. I'll be talking about managing pests in the garden. And then in 4 weeks from now, we'll have a guest presenter, Ed Levi, a master beekeeper, talking about getting started with beekeeping, which is going to be a fantastic workshop to attend. That's October 21st, same time, 5 to 6:30 Central. And you can find all these events and register at ncat.org/events, where you registered for this one. So hope to see you at one of those. Real quickly, I have 2 more questions for you all. Just a quick assessment. First, I'd like to find out from you, how useful was this online workshop? How useful was what you learned during this online workshop? 1, not useful at all. 2, 3, 4, 5, very useful. I will not share this. This will be anonymous. This will just help us in making sure what we present is relevant and useful to all of you. All right, thank you for responding to that one. And I have one more poll to launch, which is, do you plan to make any changes to your production, your garden, or your farm based on what you learned? Yes, no, or you're not sure. So will you be using what you learned tonight to make changes to your farm or garden? All right, and again, this will be anonymous. This is just for us to make sure that we are serving you with what we're presenting. All right, thank you all for responding to that. I've got a lot of yeses. That means a lot to us. All right. So we have a few minutes here for questions. I bet Margot's been taking note of a lot of the questions we've got on the chat. So we'll take a minute to address some of those.
Yes, and I believe Nina has answered several questions, and our friend Mark Schonbeck has provided a lot of good content in the chat as well. So thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
So there are one question that was asked, is there a good recommended cover crop for honeybees?
Oh, for honeybees. Okay. Yes, I can think of some. Before I answer that, one thing I forgot to mention is we will be following up with an email to all of you who registered with the resources. We put together a resource page, so we'll be sending that out. We also have an evaluation. It would be very helpful to all of us if you fill out that evaluation, which you'll be getting in an email, which will help us make sure that, again, these workshops are relevant to you. So please keep an eye out for that. Also, this webinar was recorded, and so we'll be sending out a link that you can watch the recorded workshop and share it with those who weren't able to attend. To answer your question, mustard is a very good cover crop. Any of those brassicas, but mustard especially, is a very good winter cover crop for bees. For pollinators, you'll see a lot of pollinator activity on those mustard flowers. Also, any of the clovers are very good. So crimson clover would be a great winter cover crop for honeybees. Those are a few of the ones that I mentioned.
Luke, can I jump in here for a second?
Yeah.
So we have a friend of ours who keeps bees on our property. So I am not a beekeeper, but we asked him if we could plant anything to help him. And he said white clovers are actually better than crimson clovers. Just something about the way the flowers are shaped, that the bees can get to the white clovers better than the crimson. I don't know why, but that's what he told me. So just wanted to share
Awesome.
that little tidbit.
Yeah, thanks, Nina.
Mm-hmm.
So a question was asked earlier, and it was a question about using goats to essentially terminate a cover crop. So using livestock to terminate a cover crop. The question was asked as, when do I turn the animals in to terminate the cover crop? So I'm not sure, your answer, your explanation, Luke, about, when to terminate may have answered her question, but I don't know if either one of you want to say anything about terminating cover crops with livestock. And I believe we might have an actual resource that I'll plug in the chat if I can find it.
Awesome. Thanks, Margot. Yes, livestock can be a great way to terminate cover crops. I would just make sure that the cover crop species you planted is palatable to the livestock species. I know when I was at the Kerr Center in Oklahoma, we did terminate our summer cover crops with goats. We turned them into the summer cover crop field, which we had a lot of sorghum Sudan grass. And I mean, in that case, there was an issue of some potential toxins in the sorghum Sudan grass, which we had to be careful that wasn't an issue. But the goats did a fantastic job with that. A lot of it has to do with making sure they're contained. The cover crop species is palatable to them. And also what you're going to do with the field after the livestock has grazed the cover crop. If you're planting vegetables afterwards, you'll probably still have to go in and mow down the cover crop, incorporate it, create a good seed bed or build up your beds for vegetable crops. But theoretically, yes, they can be used. Nina, anything to add there?
No, I think you covered it. The good fencing thing is the challenge with goats. But if the person's asking, they already know that. They have goats. And yeah, I think making sure Yeah, making sure that it's grazed evenly, so you get an even termination, depending on the size of the area, of course. But if you make sure you can like strip graze it, so you're only giving the animals a little bit at a time, so they graze it all down pretty hard to make sure that there's not as much residue. So there's different strategies you can use to make sure they're grazing it evenly and not leaving sort of a patchy mess behind.
Yeah. Let's see. I saw a question here from David Mervis. Hi, David. If you wanted to broadcast a cover crop now over a poorly germinated cover crop, what would you use? I would say a small seeded cover crop. So from ones I mentioned, crimson clover be a good fit. Brassicas would also work. I would say clovers would be ideal. A smaller seeded winter cover crop that can kind of work its way into soil crevices is going to be more likely to germinate and grow for you and kind of fill out any patches you have in that poor stand, especially since you're not able to incorporate it. I'm assuming since you have, a cover crop already growing that you don't want to disturb.
Okay, maybe one last question here. How can you tell if soil disturbance outweighs the benefits of a particular cover crop?
That's a great question.
You got this?
I mean, as Luke said, sometimes soil disturbance is a necessary evil. But I think if you account for it, I mean, I think people for so long thought that tillage was harmless and it was in fact beneficial. But if you know that it's going to reduce some organic matter, then if you just account for that in what you apply next, then you can outweigh that cost. I mean, I'm not a strict no-till person. I may sound like it, but I know it's necessary in some cases, and in some areas, a lot of farmers use tillage carefully and deliberately, and they can build their soil health up while using it occasionally. So I think, how can you tell if soil disturbance outweighs the benefits of a particular cover crop? I think it just depends on what your cover crop goals are, and making sure you're taking the destruction into consideration and using it very, very deliberately. Luke, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I would say cover crops are more of a drastic intervention. Maybe not drastic, but if you have great soil health and you've been building it up for years, you might get to the point where you don't have to practice tillage and you don't have to grow cover crops. But if you have a field that you have poor soil, you have, poor soil tilth, poor organic matter, low fertility, cover crops can be an intervention that can really more rapidly build up your organic matter content, soil carbon, improve the structure of the soil as, let's say, a more rapid therapy intervention. Whereas not disturbing the soil, it's a slower process where you're relying on that slow work of the soil microbiome and earthworms and all that to do their work. So I think a lot of it's the time scale. And, if I were wanting to grow on a new field plot and the soil needed help, I would grow cover crops more aggressively. And then maybe get to the point where the soil was in good shape and I didn't have to rely on cover crops to build soil health. That's one way I look at it. Would you agree with that, Nina?
I've heard people say you have to earn the right to be a no-till operation. You have to build up your soil so it's healthy enough so that you can do no-till. I saw a question kind of related to this from David. What depth would you consider acceptable for tillage. And, you know, I know a lot of the tillage equipment, it's about a 6-inch depth that it typically goes to, but then there's some like attachments to the BCS that only disturb like the top 2 inches. So really the less the better. But one of the main things you have to think about is like on the old school, like mold board plows, it completely flipped the soil over. And so you're burying your really good topsoil. So that the less you can do of that kind of plowing, the better. If you can sort of maintain your topsoil on the top, that's what you want to do. And the shallower, the better. But you know, just making sure that when you do till, it's with good reason to build the soil health.
Yes, and just one more. Sorry.
Rather than just doing it out of practice. Okay, so go ahead, Luke.
Yes, and one more thing to add, which I don't think I fairly adequately addressed, was, you know, if you're using cover crops to supplement fertility, so growing legumes instead of using nitrogen fertilizer, that would be a reason to grow cover crops and incorporate cover crops as opposed to going with a no-till strategy. Again, with vegetable crops, usually tillage is a necessary evil. Fertilization is a necessary evil. I mean, it's just a fact of life that vegetables need nitrogen in the soil, and it has to get there somehow. And legumes can be a great way to, you know, grow that nitrogen. But then tillage, like I was saying, is part of the management for legume cover crops if nitrogen incorporation is your strategy. So that would be a reason to grow cover crops if they're part of your fertility plan for nitrogen for your vegetable crops.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, we keep getting questions. I feel like we could go on forever, but we probably need to wrap this thing up.
Yes, well, I was just going to say we have all these questions, and we will go back in the chat and make sure we address these questions. We can send the answers with the resources and specific follow-up questions. And as you can see, Luke and Nina's emails are there, so you can always email them directly as well.
Yes, definitely. So you have our email addresses here. We'll try to follow up with those of you who left chats we didn't get to. And we are a resource. This is why we're here. So we'd be happy to continue the discussion on email, or, you know, you can call the NCAT ATRA hotline and talk to us that way. So thank you all for joining. We really appreciate it. We hope you gleaned some useful information, and we hope to see you again at the next ATRA webinar. Mm-hmm. All right. Bye, everybody.